Good afternoon. Welcome to the night studio at the Newseum. I'm Gene Policinski, the Chief Operating Officer of the Newseum Institute, and we're very pleased to partner with TYT Network today to bring you this program looking at how millennials will consume election news. We have a brief commercial announcement about our activities here at the Newseum in the same vein as election news. On April 15th, we'll open an exhibit we're producing in cooperation with CNN Politics. We'll take a look throughout the election season at the high points of the election year, and we hope that you'll come back and see that as it evolves. It'll be in our new media gallery, 2,500 square foot gallery up on one of the floors here that you can spend some time at and get a look at the election in a very different way. But that's what we're going to do today. We think it's extremely important in the flow of news and information and in the First Amendment's real purpose, which is to engage us in a free and open discussion without the government controlling what we say or the fear of being punished for what we say. And the ultimate expression of that in some ways is talk and speech that has to do with politics, and the ultimate expression of that in our country at the moment would seem to be the presidential election. So we're glad to talk about how a very new group of voters, we hope, or at least engaged citizens, we hope, at the very least citizens, will consume news about this election. And we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So again, welcome to the night studio, welcome to the Newseum on behalf of the Newseum Institute and our partner today, TYT Network. We're going to begin with a brief video about TYT. Thank you.
Thank you guys for watching. We literally couldn't have done it without you.
I know. There are plenty of places on the internet where you can get the ramblings of a madman for free. Nobody will pay attention to that because the mainstream media can't look into details.
What's happening to millennials, the demographic that's most impacted by this? They're unable to buy homes, they're unable to buy cars, and that has a negative impact on the economy.
Remember the last time our top tax rate was above 50%? That was after the Great Depression, after World War II, and it led to 30, 40, 50 years of sustained economic growth of a sort that the world has never seen before.
Most honest show in America. You can get bin Laden. You had 7 to 8 years to get bin Laden. You never got him.
But it was genuine. He was bad.
Ding, ding, ding. Get the fuck out of here with Benghazi.
Marco Rubio mode.
A lot of fire going on inside this head. Got to cool it down.
They're above the law. So after they riddle these guys with bullets, how dare you give them leave for 3 days?
Thankfully today we have body cameras so we could see it.
Stop resisting.
And even with that, guys like Eric Garner get choked out on the streets of New York City. Even body cameras aren't enough. It gives us just a little glimpse into the darkness at the core of American police forces.
Welcome to America. Welcome to democracy. This makes sense to any of you? We got to do a deal with our enemies. Our idiots believe in end times. Their idiots believe in end times. Luckily, we didn't listen to those idiots. Instead, we did a peace treaty so we don't have war.
Oh my God, I'm better than everyone else. I don't eat donuts, but look at these fat Americans. They like donuts.
Is she effectively dealing with obesity in America? No.
And I'd knock you out right now. Well, that's absolute BS.
We can take this up later.
Do it, fight, dudes. That'll be awesome. No matter who loses, we win.
We've been hoping this would come. It has happened. You can get same-sex marriage anywhere you want in America. All Americans. Everybody.
So this is one of those days in American history, it doesn't come along that often, where we have expanded the circle of liberty.
And the church is, oh, well, you need a good spanking.
Tell me about it.
That's what she said.
When you see Bill Gates and Warren Buffett come out and go, suck it.
My mom's like, yeah, no.
Repeal.
Bye-bye.
Anyway, I want to thank you guys all for being here today. The discussion that we're about to have is an important one, and it has to do with how young people are going to engage in the political process for something that's going to happen 1 year from today, the presidential election. What do we need to do as members of the media, as members of social media, to engage young voters, to get their attention, to make them political activists? And that's a huge problem that we're seeing right now, especially when it comes to the intersection of traditional media and new media. And so just a quick story before we get this panel started. Prior to coming here, we were having lunch and I was speaking to a young woman, a millennial, about her political ideology, where she gets her news. And she basically told me that she gets her news from her friends and from Snapchat, and that she refuses to get her news from mainstream media or cable outlets because she doesn't trust them. And even though her friends are politically active, they also don't trust traditional forms of media. So where are young people getting their news today? Are they informed, Or are they consuming propaganda? These are all topics that we're going to discuss today. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Of course, a lot of you know John Idarola. He is from TYT Network. He's the host and executive producer of Think Tank on TYT Network. So John, thank you for being with us today.
No problem.
All right. We also have Amanda Turkle from Huffington Post, who covers a wide variety of political topics. I've been following her work for a very long time. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And we got to represent the social media front. So we have John Tass-Parker, who is from Instagram. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
And last but certainly not least, we have Elizabeth Plank, who is from Mike and who has done lots of contributing work to other outlets like MSNBC. I'm really curious to hear your points of views on a lot of these different topics. So thank you for coming. Thank you for talking with us. All right, so for anyone who doesn't know me, and I'm sure there are lots of you, I'm Anna Kasparian. I'm the host of the Young Turks. I also host a show in TYT Network called The Point. This is a topic that's very important to me because I work with young people on a university level. I teach journalism at Cal State Northridge, and I'm noticing that political apathy, of course, was always a problem, but it's a growing problem. A lot of young people are more interested in frivolous topics, entertainment, sports, even when they're studying journalism. And so I ask them why they're not interested in political coverage, and it's because they have a hard time kind of navigating what the truth is and what the propaganda is, right? So I am really excited to talk to you guys about this. And before we get started, what's your go-to media outlet when you want to be informed? Where do you get informed? Amanda, I'll start with you.
Well, I highly recommend. Is my mic on?
Yeah, everyone's mic's on.
I highly recommend the Huffington Post. Obviously. But I mean, I live in Washington D.C. I still get the print version of the Washington Post, partly out of solidarity with, journalism, but also just it's nice to have something in my hands. I tend to read it a little bit closer, and I go to Twitter and Facebook and see what all my friends are posting too.
John, what about you?
Yeah, well, as you can clearly tell by the accent, I didn't grow up in the United States, but I still read Australian press, which is great. But one thing that I'm loving, especially on Instagram, is stories that are being told by traditional media outlets, but in really interesting ways. So one example would be National Geographic, and their photojournalism is utterly exceptional, and being able to consume that on Instagram every day is fantastic. Also, CNN does a brilliant job. They posted a marvelous story maybe a week ago, which was photographs of refugees' shoes as they were crossing over the border into Serbia. Obviously, this is part of a much broader, piece of media coverage across the entire world. But seeing that texture and seeing the reality of that story through this unique photojournalistic way was really compelling.
Yeah, and CNN has the resources to do that type of, incredible reporting. And, we'll talk about, some of the downsides of traditional media and the upsides of traditional media. Liz, what about you?
I love Twitter. I think it gives me a glimpse of what at least journalists are talking about. I think it is sort of a bubble, so it can be limiting in terms of the perspectives that you can get. I also buy the New York Times every Sunday.
That's awesome.
So like a real millennial, I read the paper, and that for me is a really important ritual, actually. In the same way that I kind of want to support journalism, and I'm you get very different perspectives, and it always is really fun. And yeah, I'll go on Instagram. I go to Facebook to feel completely overwhelmed and feel like I don't know anything. And then, but I think the great thing is that there's so many different sources. So my parents used to just get up. That's what they still do. And then they get the paper at the door, and that's the perspective that they get. And I feel like we have so many different outlets, and I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, 50 years ago, there would be limited sources. You would have maybe one of 3 or 4 media outlets that you'd go to get your information, to get your news. And things have really exploded with cable and also, of course, with the internet. And so, again, it's difficult to navigate the propaganda from the actual information. And what I love is that you guys gave a wide variety of sources that you go to, whether it's new media or traditional media. John, I'm going to speak for you. Of course, you get all your news from the Young Turks. No, we obviously need to get our news somewhere else.
I know the host too well now.
Right. So real quick, what is your go-to media source?
Well, like you say, it's easy to self-select now in the internet age. I used to go to just like KCRW, the Young Turks, and a couple blogs like Smirking Chimp and Daily Kos and things like that. But now that I know a little bit more about the media, I definitely try to diversify. I go to like New York Times and Reuters and like the AP for some of the big, especially international stories, statistical analyses of news off of like 538. Infographics and stuff like that off of Vox. And then I supplement that with several different subreddits that aggregate much smaller sites that I don't have time to check literally 50 to 100 blogs every day, but there are some communities online that I trust to curate some of that. And so I try to make sure that I'm not self-selecting in terms of media.
Okay, great.
Actually, I go to Fox News every day.
Right. I mean,
if for no other reason to screen cap the front page. That always is fun.
Right, and to compare and contrast, I mean, my journalism class, one of my favorite things to do in the beginning of every class is to just go to the front page of Fox, MSNBC, and CNN, and just compare and contrast. And of course, there's huge differences, and we have long discussions about political biases.
Well, you have to go to CNN every day to find out which plane is missing in the world at any given time.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so let's get started with what we can do to kind of hone in on young voters, how to get them politically active. So what kind of differences have you guys noticed between new media and traditional media in how they're trying to grab young viewers' attention, if they're trying to grab young viewers' attention at all? Liz, I'll start with you.
So what we do at Mike is we think that our audience is very smart. We think young people are very smart. We reach 1 in 5 college-educated millennials in the U.S. So we don't sort of use condescending language or like cat videos. Like we don't like smuggle information in the cat videos or the GIFs. We actually think young people are very smart and are just as smart as any other generation. And we are the most educated generation in history, by the way. We're also the most diverse generation in history. So we take that into account in the way that we do our coverage. And I think what I'm most excited about is sort of that tone. And I think where there's a huge contrast with that is the way that politicians talk to young people. I'm the host of a web series called Flip the Script, and we did a whole episode on the Beyonce voters, this term that was invented on Fox News. Does anyone know what the Beyonce voters are? Who they are? No? Oh my God, you have to Google it. I can't remember, this Fox News contributor was like talking about young voters, talking about young women who vote, and they were like, young women, and like talking about young liberal women, obviously, the ones who voted for Obama and are like, basically going to be determining who the next president is because they're a huge voting bloc. So Fox News was very like angry at these women for voting liberal, and this Fox News contributor started talking about how they're like the Beyonce voters, because they either depend on their boyfriend or the president to like give them benefits. Like it was like the weirdest thing. Yeah. And so instead of, obviously it was like a huge blow and we covered it and we were like, what the hell, Fox? But then that term was like sort of taken back by social media. So there was a Tumblr created called Beyonce Voters. I don't remember who created it, but some badass woman was like, oh, Beyonce voters? Like Beyonce's awesome. Like why would you use Beyonce as like a bad thing? That's a great thing. Thank you. Beyonce's, one of like an example of an empowered modern woman. I want to be like Beyonce. So she like used Beyonce quotes and put them, like juxtaposed them on images of like badass women in politics. So like Elizabeth Warren, Michelle Obama. Anyway, you should look it up. It's amazing. And I think that was like a perfect example of, young people taking the conversation back from old media and basically being able to take it back and also be very engaged.
I like that you touched on the condescending nature of, the politicians and some media outlets when it comes to speaking about young voters and even covering them. So one thing that I've come across quite a bit on media outlets that don't necessarily mean to be cruel to young voters is they'll cover these studies or these analyses on young people, and they'll say things like, new poll indicates that young people are narcissistic. And so what kind of impact do you think that has, Amanda, on young people? Do you think that's really pushing them away and kind of forcing them to get their news from things like Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat? Do you think that they're taking that in and they're saying, all right, whatever, I still need the information, I still need the news, I'll still watch? And are there any mitigating factors within traditional media outlets to stop that from happening?
It's definitely a turnoff. We had a reporter recently who just put in sort of a snarky, fun throwaway line about millennials being a little self-centered, and people did not like that on Twitter and really reacted. And again, he meant it in a joking way, but people who are of that generation, it's not funny because they know that's not true. And what millennials we find like to hear about are issues. And issues of student loans, the economy, campus sexual assault, marijuana legalization, just basically issues. Those are what drive people to sites. I think you're right when we were talking earlier about a lot of people feel disconnected from the political process and from politicians, but millennials are incredibly engaged when it comes to issues, criminal justice, things like that. And they get a lot of their news about how they can get engaged online. I was in Ferguson covering the protests there, and I talked to people about how they heard about this was happening today. I was surprised. I heard about it. And they all said they heard about it through social media. Their friends posted it on Facebook. They saw it on Twitter. And so that's the way that they are getting these news. They are interested in social issues. And maybe they weren't initially. Maybe they didn't go online deliberately saying, I want to find out how to go to this protest. I want to read what's going on with the Ferguson Council. But because their friends are talking about it, they run across that news, they become engaged. So a lot of young people are coming across the news simply because it's there. It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, you can't miss it. They happen across it, and then they're suddenly interested in this issue that they didn't seek out.
That's an excellent point. John, we were talking a little earlier, John Idarola and I were talking a little earlier about all these different political movements that happened over the past year, or at least political causes that really made headway this past year. So there were things like Cecil the Lion, which we're all familiar with, right? There's Black Lives Matter, which is a much larger issue that's still gaining momentum in the country. And I feel like social media has been used as a way not to only inform, but also a way to mobilize young people in order to raise awareness about these issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think against the context that over the next year up until election day, one thing to remember is this is going to be the most visual election to date. Whether it's candidates and campaigns being able to produce content themselves, whether it's journalists or whether it's voters who are actually capturing content and then posting it. So I think that's the kind of like frame from which to think through. The other thing is that 70% of the followers of US presidential candidates on Instagram are actually voting age millennials. And so what we're seeing is that the way that they're engaging with this political discourse is through really creative ways. So one thing that we saw, which was fantastic and really fascinating, was the Babies for Bernie kind of like a hashtag campaign almost. And then also the Trump Your Cat. So what I think is really interesting about that is that when you talk about millennials engaging in the political discourse, it's going to be visual. I think that's really important to remember. And then on top of that, I think they're also going to be really creative. And they're going to have this tongue-in-cheek approach to being able to engage with these issues. On top of that, though, there are serious moments. So in the Baltimore riots, there was a beautiful photograph that was captured that ended up on the front cover of Time magazine. That was captured on Instagram by a young person who was engaging with that civic moment. And so what we're seeing is this huge population, this big demographic of people that are politically aware, politically active, very intelligent, being able to take an interesting angle on these moments, and then also they're posting content.
Yeah, I mean, I think about a much older movement that, of course, has fizzled out since then. Occupy Wall Street. When it was first formed, there was a huge difference between the way it was covered on cable TV and the way it was covered in print and also digital media, right? So I feel like in print and digital media, there was a seriousness to that story. There was very little minimizing of the people that were taking part in it or the message that they were trying to send. But no one during that time can really forget Erin Burnett's moment of really, when she was talking about the protesters, she didn't really take them seriously. And as those moments happen more and more, the traditional media continuously pushes young voters away because Occupy Wall Street was talking about issues that are relevant to young voters. I love that Amanda brought up student loan debt. Very rarely do you hear politicians talk about student loan debt. They might dabble with it a little bit during their campaigns, but it's never really the heart of their campaign. It's not something that they care about truly. They talk about the economy in the sense of, okay, well, what should we do about corporate taxes? They don't talk about the economy in the sense that young voters are unable to graduate find gainful employment, and then actually contribute to that economy with money that they're earning from a good job. And so these are issues that aren't covered enough. And John, I wanted to ask you, what other issues do you think politicians and traditional media aren't focusing on enough, or aren't focusing on enough, that you would like to see, that maybe you see in digital media or new media?
Well, I would say issues generally, just issues. I mean, have you been watching the debates? Honestly, like when they're not being criticized for not being substantive, they're not being substantive. And lately, in the last one with CNBC, they made some brief attempts to try. Please let me be substantive. I'm trying to ask you about your tax policy, and they're like, no, I'm not talking about that. But I think they will generally raise an important issue one time, like raise your hand if you believe in gravity, raise your hand if you believe in climate change. And I think that climate change long term is one of the most important issues facing not just millennials, but humans.
Right.
And it's not talked about. It's rarely even acknowledged publicly that it exists. I would say that that's incredibly important. I think that you made a good point about talking about student loan debt and then tying it into the inability to contribute in a meaningful way to the economy. How can you when you're paying $500 to $1,000 per month to Sally Mae specifically? Right. That money could be going to Subway and Amazon and a car dealer and a whole bunch of other places. But instead it all goes to one big bank that then sits on $3 trillion rather than putting it back into the economy. The fact that they do that isn't even raised. The importance of money in politics isn't openly talked about. Perhaps it would have if they'd allowed Larry Lessig to even show up at the last Democratic debate, and now he's dropped out.
Yeah.
Because the moneyed interests and the DNC combined forces to stop that issue from being raised, and now it's not going to be raised. Not by Lessig at any event.
Sorry. Go ahead. And I want to say, they're actually, candidates, when they do put out detailed policy proposals, they often don't get enough attention. Hillary Clinton has actually put out quite a few incredibly detailed policy proposals on opiate addiction, on gun violence, on Wall Street reform, really detailed, a lot of them very strong, but you don't hear about them as much because everyone is talking about her emails and everyone's talking about Benghazi. And so when candidates do this and they try to get more attention, it's ignored because it's not as exciting or whatever.
So how do we fight back against that? Because the narrative is always hijacked by the mainstream press. I mean, I think about the Edward Snowden story. When that leak came out about the NSA spying on all of us, we weren't talking about what the government was doing wrong. We were talking about whether or not Edward Snowden betrayed the American government and whether or not he should be tried for espionage, right? So why is it that happens? When a big story comes out, we allow the mainstream press to kind of hijack the narrative and run with it. What can we do to fight back against that, Liz?
I actually think, I want to push back against the idea that social media by nature is, and I'm not saying anyone on this panel has said that, but I think there's this narrative that's part of this, condescension about millennials and the way that we consume news and the things that we do. That social media is inherently less credible, I guess, or important as traditional media. And I think that we've done a really good job of galvanizing, and whether it's on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter, and changing the narrative in mainstream media. So we've seen examples of, my favorite example was Wendy Davis, coming out of nowhere with her filibuster while CNN was talking about blueberry muffins. I think there was a screenshot of them talking about blueberry muffins while she was doing an 11-hour filibuster that no mainstream media was covering at the moment. But there were thousands of people watching it on Twitter, watching the live stream and tweeting about it. At a certain point, the Stand With Wendy hashtag had 1,200 tweets a minute. So the next day, everyone was like, holy shit, we gotta cover this. And so it changed the narrative in traditional media. It changed everything. We started talking about this law, and I don't think we would have talked about it otherwise. And Wendy Davis became this icon and this powerful force, and the sort of pro-choice movement got a lot of steam from that. And also, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is now, because of their physical protests, but also protests online, have become major planks of Bernie Sanders' campaign. Hillary Clinton has had to address it. We talk about it at debates. DeRay might co-host the next Democratic. Is that something I saw somewhere? That Twitter and DeRay, who's a very big activist who's part of the Black Lives Matter movement, might be moderating or co-moderating a debate. That's huge. So I actually think traditional media is very worried about new media, and they're paying a lot more attention than we think they are.
When do you guys think political candidates are going to take new media seriously enough to actually allow a new media outlet to host a debate? Because right now, the big players are CNN, Fox News, CNBC, and I don't know, the debate that really stood out to me the most, even though everyone's talking about CNBC, was the CNN debate, GOP debate, because what it really was the moderator sitting back and saying, yo, Trump, guess what that homeboy said next to you? What do you think, right? And then they're all of a sudden getting into a ridiculous argument as if they're high schoolers. And I want to see a serious debate, but yes, the moderators are part of the problem. How do we get candidates to take new media seriously if they're too busy trying to reform the way old media is doing things? Amanda, what do you think?
Well, I think you'll see that soon, but you're seeing a little bit more attention than you have in the past. I remember it was a really big deal when Huffington Post got to ask the president a question.
Yes.
And now we're beyond that. We've interviewed the president. Hillary Clinton has talked to new media outlets. The other candidates have as well. But there still is this perception by a lot of candidates who tend to be older that TV news is where it's at. We have to go with the big print publications. There's nothing more exciting than getting your story in the New York Times. And there are people who are on these campaigns who still believe that, despite the numbers telling them that is not how people get their news. So I think it will, there are a lot of younger staffers on the campaign who understand that we need to be on social media, we need to be talking to these digital outlets, we need to be on podcasts and all of that. But it takes some work, because where the candidates get their news, they want to be on those outlets. They want to be. I had a staffer on the Hill tell me that they, kept trying to convince the lawmaker they work for that, like, we don't need to have you. I think it was Cat Fancy magazine. Like, you don't need to. And she's like, that's what I read. That is where I want to be. She's like, that's not the best for your image, maybe. So.
And when they go on new media, they have to do it well, because there's nothing worse than like the cringeworthy. I mean, I don't know if you guys follow any candidates on like
to appeal
Snapchat.
to millennials,
Yeah.
and it comes off as very fake.
Exactly,
and
and like contrived, and you're just like, no, you're not cool. Like, you're worse. Just get off, or like get young people on your campaign to like inform your decisions.
It kind of reminds me of political candidates when they release their iTunes playlist, right? It's like, that's been vetted, okay? And like they
make that.
Gotta include the country song in there. Gotta make sure maybe like a hip hop song, but it's gotta be like a Will Smith hip hop song. No cursing, no
When
nothing.
ABBA's on there, I think it's genuine, though.
Absolutely.
But if I could say one thing, so I think that there's the old media being a little bit afraid and distrustful of the new media, but I also think that there's candidates being afraid and distrustful of millennials and new media, because I think there is this political industrial complex of access and money, that the big companies own the big media outlets, and then the candidates know, if I go here, I'm going to be treated with respect, and they know that they're not going to be asked the hard questions. And the politicians want at least the image, the veneer, that they are talking to millennials directly, or they're talking to new media outlets. But when given the opportunity, they don't actually do it. And so recently, Barack Obama had a sit down with 3 YouTubers. Mm-hmm. And so that's cool. He's talking to millennials. He's talking to these young people. Were they political YouTube channels? No. How busy were you? I wasn't that busy.
I mean, I can make room in my schedule to talk to the president of the United States, right?
He talked to lovely people, Glozell, Bethany Mota, I believe, and Hank Green. Hank Green's awesome and a really smart guy, and he does talk occasionally about politics, but it's not a political channel. So even then, they don't want to sit down with the person who's going to breach that political industrial contract they have and ask the hard questions.
Well, that kind of brings up the issue of access, which is a huge problem in media today. So if you are a journalist who wants access to these politicians and even to celebrities, you know that you're unlikely to get them if you're willing to ask the tough questions. So there are shows like Hardball, for instance, which once in a while do ask tough questions. But overall, you're not going to get every guest you want if you are going to play hardball. And so how do you combat that? That's a really difficult thing to fight. And I know, John, on TYT, for instance, we do have a very, very young audience. We don't have a lot of big guests. Is that a downside of our network? Do you think there's a way around it? What do you think about all that?
I mean, I think it is potentially a downside for our network, to the extent that having them on our show would help get us views. But I think in a very real sense, it's a downside to them, because having them on our network would get them views. Mm-hmm. And for some candidates especially, like, okay, until Trump craters in a month or so, He doesn't need people to be watching him. He can choose what radio show he goes on, but when he slips down to 18% or 12%, he's going to want those views again. And there's candidates who are far smaller that could do for a few million views of an interview, especially amongst a group that we know is going to vote generally, historically, at lower rates than others. And I think that they are harming themselves more than us. We're doing fine. I don't care if most of these candidates go on. Joe Webb can do whatever he wants. But maybe it would have helped him if he had been, or they had been, the candidate or candidates who had been willing to go before. A little bit more critical analysis, a younger analysis that comes from a different point of view, that hasn't been sort of physically and spiritually killed by years and years of paying taxes and bills and all that, and still has this sense of college idealism that is, even in my case, slipping away day by day.
Oh, John.
Maybe they could have done that, and that would have been worth something to them, but it's too late for most of them.
Right.
But
Well,
we've got a channel. We got 2IT interviews.
We do. And
I
think a lot of candidates, it's funny, they won't, yes, I'd love to have Bernie on. It's difficult for candidates to come on and talk about their policy ideas when they know they're going to be asked tough questions, especially when they don't have policy ideas, like Donald Trump. But all we need to do is elect him, and then he'll come up with the policy ideas that'll make your head spin, okay? He's really good. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. So, John, I want to talk to you about your experience with politicians, political movements, and social media. So, have you seen any politicians use social media in an effective way to reach out to young voters?
Yeah, funnily enough, I have. So I wanted to pick you up on what you were talking about before. I actually think that some of these campaigns are doing really well. I think they're really engaging with millennials, with the social media audience, in ways that we haven't seen before in any political cycle. And so, one example that I love, that I've been looking at lately, is the way that both the Bernie Sanders campaign and then also the Ben Carson campaign has just built this huge community of people that are producing content, and they're actually encouraging people to do so, and they're resharing it onto their platform.
That's fascinating.
So what it's actually doing is it's empowering an audience to actually engage. And so having that visual two-way conversation is innately how I would encourage campaigns to actually engage with millennials. It's giving them that that right to actually be involved, and they're doing it brilliantly on Instagram. Can
you juxtapose Ben Carson's campaign on social media versus Bernie Sanders' campaign? Because I got to be honest, I haven't seen much of Ben Carson's social media.
Yeah, I actually look that it's not they're just two examples of many, but. Look, I really enjoy seeing that content. It does speak to a big audience. He's obviously done very well across many platforms. The Bernie Sanders campaign is, what I love seeing from there is when he has those huge rallies, voters actually producing content from them. And so their friends are seeing that they are at that particular rally, or that they're at that event. It may not just be a Bernie rally, it could be any insert whatever candidate, but people are actually producing the content. And so that social context is really important. Your friends are seeing you post that image of you really excited about some kind of political moment, which is really rare, at least from a historical point of view, where you have that moment.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about including and engaging young voters into news content, because that's one thing that's been pretty successful for us at TYT. We care about viewer engagement quite a bit, and it's not just for the benefit of saying, hey, our viewers are engaged with us. It's because we want to make sure that they're having a conversation with us, that they're actually involved in the political process, that they're involved in the political movements that are important to us and also important to them. Do you guys see examples of media involving young voters and finding a way to engage them in their content so their voices are actually being heard? Anyone want to take that?
Well, if I can just give an example, we recently interviewed the president, which was amazing. And we, instead of, so our editor-in-chief, Jake Horowitz, interviewed Obama, which is awesome. But instead of just coming up with all these questions that we in our newsroom created or that he wanted to ask the president, we actually crowdsourced, and it was the first crowdsourced, internationally crowdsourced interview with the president. So we were talking about the Iran deal specifically, and so we sort of put out a request for all kinds of questions all over the world. We had a question from Egypt, from a young millennial in Egypt, from someone living in Israel, someone living in Iran, and someone living in the US. And I think that was, and we gave it the iPad to the president, and he saw that, the person could have a video question, not talking directly to the president, but pretty much. And I thought that was like a great example of being able to empower young people to have a voice while still, obviously doing journalism and asking the tough questions. Having young people ask those questions directly, I think was really cool. If I can just like totally brag about Mike for a second.
Well, that's a great example. I think crowdsourcing is very, very important because you get, the general stance of young people, what they care about, what's important for them. Amanda, I know that, on Huffington Post, of course, it's a site that's known for people who can share their opinions, that can blog on there. Has that been a useful way of, engaging millennials and getting them involved in news coverage?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're always looking for new voices. I always have people contacting me saying that they have something they want to write. We help them get set up on the site. And I mean, also the way to engage millennials and make sure what they care about is being heard is honestly just old-fashioned journalism.
Yep.
Just talking to them, hearing what they care about, what's going on in their lives, and reporting on that, rather than sort of sitting there and saying, here's what we think you should care about. And social media is great for that. I mean, you get access to a lot more people. Yeah. Really easily. I can, direct message someone and say, here's my number, give me a call, I want to hear what's going on. And I do think that news outlets are starting to realize that, are using Twitter in that way. I think Black Twitter has been great at getting that, at doing that, and making sure that criminal justice stays in the news and news outlets continue to cover it. I remember the LA Times actually hired someone specifically to cover Black Twitter. I don't know how that went. We did not do that, but it's obviously, Twitter is something we watch, what's going on in Black Twitter and making sure that African American voices get heard, as they often don't in the media. And so I think, again, just old-fashioned journalism, just listen to what people are talking about and try to report on it, because those are the stories that people are interested in.
Absolutely. So John Idarola, I noticed that something that has been very successful on Think Tank is you have a wide variety of topics you cover, right? And your audience is extremely young, right? And I noticed that while you have the really serious political stories time to time, or maybe even an evergreen informational video, you also have like the much lighter topics. Do you think that the lighter topics take away from the serious political coverage that you do on your channel, or do you think it actually hooks young people in?
Maybe both. I mean, maybe from the point of view of somebody who is evaluating how serious I am or the channel is, yeah, it might take away from it, actually. But I'm not really making the videos for them anyway, so whatever. But I would say I think that it is supposed to hook people. Actually, I think that implies that there's sort of a motive to it. We don't have the light stuff with the hard stuff so that you'll watch the hard stuff. We have the light stuff and the hard stuff because the whole purpose is to go out and find interesting things every day. And some interesting things are hard and some interesting things are soft, I guess. That's weird. That doesn't sound right. And so that's the whole point, is to go out there and to show that like being in college, because it used to be a college show back in the day, you can go out and you can discover new interesting things that you didn't know would be interesting for you, that you didn't know you might want to have as your career.
Yeah.
Like I was a computer programmer in college.
Well,
now I do politics.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have both, because both are important. And in politics, both are important. There are political issues that are shallow-ish or whatever, and then there are ones that are deadly serious. And so I think that consuming news of both types gets you ready to deal with politics of both types.
There seems to be this like tut-tut mentality when it comes to some news outlets where they'll frown upon the lowbrow stories. And by lowbrow stories, I mean like maybe the entertainment stories, maybe a Kanye story where he's saying that he's going to run for president, right? Maybe they'll say, oh, that's lowbrow news, we don't want to cover it. But then they'll have like a spring break story where they're showing women in bikinis and they're like, can you believe it? Look at what's happening to the youth of America today. Let's take a look at these videos for the next 10 minutes, right? So it's interesting to kind of compare the coverage. And so I always wonder, do millennials want the lighter stuff, right? Do millennials get turned off by the lighter stuff? I look at outlets like BuzzFeed, and BuzzFeed was made fun of for a long time as being nothing more than a website for cat videos and things like that. But now BuzzFeed has turned into this huge media empire that includes a lot of serious reporting in their news section. Like I go to their news section every day, and they have some very in-depth reporting, even on foreign policy and what's happening abroad in the Middle East. So I've noticed that Huffington Post does that a lot as well, and they get a lot of criticism for it, especially on the front page. What would your response be to that, Amanda?
So, I mean, I don't read half of the stuff on Huffington Post. I think a lot of it's silly, but I mean, I click on a lot of the lighter stories too. Everyone clicks on them. That's why they're there. If you don't want to read them, you don't have to read them. No one is making you read them. But what, I get very frustrated by older journalists. And I was at a journalism retreat once, and an older respected journalist was receiving an award, and he used his award speech to bash 20-something bloggers who work at the Huffington Post, not knowing that I was sitting there. And at the time, I was in my 20s, and everyone sort of awkwardly looked at me. And I later confronted him about it because it was just so uninformed. I'm not ruining journalism. In fact, people like me wouldn't have been in journalism, not too long ago, but thanks to things like blogs and, social media, I discovered more than just my local paper, and I realized that this is something I could get involved in. I didn't have to go to journalism school. I didn't have to take the traditional route. So, I think that back to your question now. It's just sort of.
You're still mad at that guy, aren't you?
I am. It's sort of a pet peeve of, there's only one way to present journalism, and you have to be serious all the time. At Huffington Post, we cover serious political topics, but we may have a little bit more voice, we may have a little bit more edge. And what I like about a lot of millennial news consumers is that you're smart enough to know that, yes, here's a cat video, and next to it, there's a story about TPP, and I can read this, and I recognize it's a good story, and I like the fact that there are links in it, and I can click on that. I can discover news sources. I may not like that news source, but I find the media literacy of millennials just so much higher than that of older generation because, in part, because things like blogs, linked through everything and you can explore different parts of the internet, and because you are getting so much news through social media that you're running across from your friends. You may not agree with them, but you explore what they're linking to, what they're saying, and you're not just relying on your one local paper and the nightly news and everything they say is gospel. You are discovering what you want to read, what you believe in. And so I find, that's why I think that people are smart enough to know that you can have the fluffy stuff, right, the soft news, and you can also have the hard news. And you just know enough to where to go and what to read.
Yeah, at the end of the day, an interesting story is an interesting story, right?
And you can tell if it's well reported.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that, and also in parallel to that is the way that that candidates have started to use, the way that they have used social media in general has changed so dramatically in the same way that obviously journalism has. There is so much choice for millennials. And the other thing that I would say is that millennials as a group is, it's not a monolithic group. There's obviously a diverse range of demographics that break down within that. But they have a choice as to what kind of content they want to consume. And so if we're talking about what I work on every day, which is how are they going to engage with political candidates on our platform? You need to speak to them in their language. You need to speak to them in this great visual space, and you need to be creating content that's actually going to engage them in some way as well. And ultimately, that's got to be creative. And that's what they want to. It doesn't have to be too light or too dark or too heavy or too soft, but it has to be somehow able to connect with them.
I love that you touched on language because that's something that I noticed is a big thing with young viewers and young voters as well. One thing that I thought would be the downfall of TYT when I first started was that it wasn't a scripted, very produced show. Like, we didn't have teleprompters, we're speaking off the cuff, and I was like, I don't know, does this fall under the guise of journalism? Isn't there supposed to be a prompter? Shouldn't we have writers? And then it ended up being something that worked to our advantage because, yes, while it took a very long time to learn how to read and research and actually keep all of that information in your head as you're doing these newscasts, I realized that we were having these conversations with our audience as opposed to speaking to them like this, right? Being very, very fake. And there's something really great about that because, I'll meet with fans and they'll tell me that they feel like they know me personally. And just the casual, laid-back nature of new media, I think, has played a huge role in how it's exploded in the last few years. What do you think, Liz?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people crave that kind of unfiltered rawness, right? And that's why platforms like Snapchat are so popular, because it's not like, it's completely the opposite of what you see when you turn on your TV, which is like the studio, like blah, 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 and the teleprompter, and you know that everything is written out and not, you know, that the person saying it because they came up with it. And, you know, Flip the Script is all about not having scripts and like going out and like going to Times Square and seeing what people say about a certain topic. We recently sort of like crashed this like pro-life convention brunch thing.
Awesome.
And we're just like, well, we came in with an idea of what we thought we would get, and then we got something completely different. And then decided, I mean, that changed the course of our reporting. And I think that's exactly how life works, and that's how the media should work too. And I think it comes back to what I think we've had a really interesting conversation about, you know, is entertainment different than news, or should they be completely different? Like, I think a lot of the most interesting things coming out of sort of the revolution in media is coming from the entertainment space. Like what John Oliver's doing is amazing, and it's reporting, and it falls under entertainment. But we have young people watching 20-minute monologues about very important topics, and that driving the news on Monday morning.
Yes.
All of the media outlets on the internet, at least, are sharing these videos and talking about these topics. So again, it's driving it's driving the conversation.
Yeah, John Oliver is a great example. One of my pet projects, or I don't know if you call it a pet project, but one of the more passionate issues is for-profit colleges. And everyone at TYT is so tired of me bringing up for-profit colleges because it's not a fun topic to talk about. You know, you have these colleges that have, investors, they're ripping off students, they have deceptive recruiting techniques, and they're having these students take out all these federal loans. 95% of their revenue is from federal loans. I'm about to do a newscast on it right now, okay? That's how passionate I am. And John Oliver does his monologue on it, and boom, the next day, everyone's talking about for-profit colleges and what a scam they are. And that was such a great moment for me because I don't care who's reporting it. As long as someone reports it and it gets the attention it needs, I'm happy. Yeah. I tried reporting on it for years and it got a little bit of traction. And to know that somebody finally kind of got through to the electorate, to the American audience, meant the world to me. And it kind of goes to what you were talking about, John, using the right language, finding creative ways to kind of get the message across. And comedy has been a huge part of that. I mean, Jon Stewart was one of the most trusted journalists out there, and he's not a journalist, he's a comedian. So I think that laid-back comedic nature does speak volumes to a lot of young people, and just Americans in general, right? Yeah. So you touched on Snapchat a little bit, Liz, and it's incredible how quickly technology is progressing, because I like to think of myself as someone who keeps up with the times, but I can't fathom getting my news from Snapchat. How the hell does that work?
I don't get it either.
Isn't it supposed to be for sexting? Like, what happened?
Oh my God.
Why not
both? Talk about Snapchat. I feel like I was talking to everyone before. I was like, I feel like a Snapchat evangelist. Like, I always talk about Snapchat. I love Snapchat. If you guys have it, my username is Liz Plank. Follow me. I'll follow you back. It'll be really fun. No dick pics will be sent. I've never used it for sexting. I literally got on it because about a year ago, and I've seen it like transform into a really cool platform where a lot of people are having conversations and consuming content in a really, really new way. And I see it driving other, even like, okay, this is like a random example, but there's like a Shock Top commercial. Do you guys see this commercial? It's on Hulu right now all the time, and it's like this conversation between like the Shock Top orange and like a random person on the street. And it's like they're just talking and like it's totally ridiculous. And it's like unfiltered, drink Shock Top. And I see it's really changing the way, like they're like, oh, we're trying to do this too, with like companies are trying to pull it off. But coming back to news, I think it's, during the Charleston shooting, one of the most compelling pieces of media out there was actually the Charleston story on Snapchat. So there are real people who are curating basically these stories on Snapchat. There's one for each city, but there's also one for the campaign, or if there's a debate, and then an event like Charleston, and you could just see people praying, people talking about the people that they'd lost. It was like very moving and very gripping. And again, images, when I looked at CNN, it was the same thing over and over again, the photo of the shooter doing whatever. And Snapchat was a completely different story that I wouldn't have gotten any other way. So I think it's again, this crowdsourcing and rawness, the intersection of both that's really awesome. I think what Snapchat needs to do is really harness that more in the Discover. I think the Discover tab is pretty awful, or could use a lot of changes, and because I think it's very animated and not raw and not unfiltered.
So this brings up the question that comes up over and over again in various tragedies and also election cycles. People who share all of this raw information on social media and on blogs, are they considered journalists? Are they people that should have the same protections as a journalist would, a traditional journalist would? I mean, I think this is a complicated question. You can even get into the issue of whistleblowers. Are they considered journalists? But people who engage in these social media platforms and they share this information with the world, are they journalists? Are they community journalists? Are they traditional journalists? What would you consider them, Amanda?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I can answer when we use this information. If I'm trying to incorporate this information into a news story, how am I going to use it? And I need to check it out. I don't take everything and just put it into my story because it looks legitimate, because a lot of times you find out it's not. Right. There have been so many times when there's some sort of tragedy and Twitter is moving really fast and you look at a picture and it seems like this person was there and it ends up they weren't there and they just put up some pictures. So you still, as a reporter, I still can't take that information and just assume all these people, because they put something up, seem like journalists. I still need to try to get their information, call them, talk to them as I would a regular source, try to confirm it somewhere else. So they're not quite there yet, but you can't deny that they are. A lot of times they're on the ground. They may be at an event that a journalist isn't at, and they're the eyes and ears there. And so I don't know what status they get, what protections, but it's certainly, as a journalist, a great resource, and it's great, for just transparency and making sure that, politicians say something, someone is there to capture it.
The transparency is a great part, especially when it comes to things like, police brutality stories and some of the videos that people capture on their cell phones. John?
Yeah, so I want to say something kind of related to that. So I did a video on Think Tank about sort of the tools that you need to have as a person to consume information and to be able to evaluate whether it's actually true. Because the downside of there literally being millions of journalists or quasi-journalists or whatever is that while it seems like shockingly the vast majority of what they share is true, they theoretically could manipulate you. And very often activists or candidates or political parties will spread memes that are patently false, or images from events that aren't actually from there, or quotes that aren't actually said by that person ever, or said by anybody. And so I think that as millennials, well, just as people, we need to train ourselves with the new tools that are required to be able to tell, has this image been manipulated? Is this quote being missourced? Is that fact untrue? Or is it technically true in a very particular way, like Carly Fiorina's 90% of all the jobs lost thing? And I think that the media can do a little bit to train them in that. There are websites that you can plug in an image and it will tell you, has this been manipulated? You can put up an image and it'll say, these are the other places it's been uploaded. That shit's been up for 6 years. It didn't just happen at a Tea Party rally. And I think that we can teach ourselves that, and we need to start to understand them. It was much easier back in the day. If they say it on the evening news, it's probably been sourced, it's probably true. There's more risk now, but we can get rid of a little bit of that risk.
Yeah, the thing I hate the most is, and it's happened to us, I've fallen victim to this, when there's like a light news story that's going viral and everyone's talking about it, and you're like, ooh, that's fun. And it's covered by a lot of serious news outlets, so you take it seriously. You do the story, and then the next day or the night of, you find out that it was a house. And you're like,
how many times, like the fake Trump account? The Daily Beast. I mean, I feel like every serious news outlet has reported on a Trump tweet that just was from the fake account.
I know, it's disastrous. It happens to the best of us. All right, guys, unfortunately we're out of time, but we do want to take some of your questions, some social media questions. Praveen, do you have them for me already?
So first question from Twitter is #TYTLive. What is your advice to engage millennials to become activists beyond liking a political message posted on Facebook or Twitter?
Who wants to take this one?
I think one thing is find, and what we were just talking about before, are people who create social media content, are they journalists or what are they? At the very least, like one thing that they definitely are storytellers. And so to answer that question, how can you encourage them to become involved? Find a story that matters to you, and find a creative way of capturing that image, that video, that story, and then get it out there. And it may just be for your friends, but it may get a little bit bigger than that. It may get a little discovered by one of these guys who can then turn around and amplify it.
Yeah. There's so many avenues in which something can go viral. I mean, you have all of these free tools at your disposal, whether it's a social media account, whether it's a blog, a YouTube channel. There's so many different ways, and you really don't know what kind of story is going to get the most traction. So the example I like to give the most is the Trayvon Martin story. I remember we were one of the first outlets to report on it. We saw the story reported by the Associated Press. I thought it was an egregious story, so I pitched it for the show. We cover it, and boom, I mean, it just took off like crazy. And it became a topic that we were passionate about because we had noticed that there was this huge injustice in our so-called justice system, that there was a disparity between how, white drug offenders are treated compared to black drug offenders. And so it became a topic that we were passionate about. And now we're reporting on it more than ever. The Black Lives Matter movement is gaining more and more traction. And to know that there is a movement now is a great feeling, and hopefully it ends in a good way. But I think passion is always the most important thing. If you're passionate about a topic, it will resonate with other people, and you could mobilize others to become politically active.
And there are people who may already be mobilizing too, right? So it's about, finding a story, finding your passion, but also finding your tribe. I think what social media has done, which is so amazing, is that you can meet people you would have never, ever met in your life if you hadn't been on the internet, right? So we used to assemble according to who lives close to me in my neighborhood, or who's my age, who's looks like me. And now it's if I go on the Black Lives Matter hashtag, I can follow and interact with people that may not even, be close to me geographically, but who we can exchange ideas with and organize. I've organized and become very, very close with people I've never met in my life. And really those people are out there, and they're, it's about finding that community, and it empowers everyone once you do.
I think what's really characteristic of millennials in general as well is this idea between the online and the offline life. Is that differentiation is becoming very, very, very subtle now. And so what you're talking about, you've got friends that are from social media that you've never met before in real life, but they're your friends.
Yeah. They are.
And if there is something you care about, online petitions actually often get a lot of notice. It's something that we cover. You probably read news stories saying that this issue has a petition on change.org. It's gotten 3,000 signatures. Those make a big difference, especially at the local level. If you start a petition and you get maybe a couple hundred people to sign it, a local news outlet may cover it. It freaks out a local business or whoever it's targeted at, and suddenly your online action is translating to something in the real world. I recently covered a White House petition started by a guy who felt passionate about the U.S. accepting more Syrian refugees. He started a petition. It got enough signatures. And the White House responded, and the White House actually invited him to Washington for a meeting about the issue. And he just started a petition, but it snowballed. It was something he was passionate about, other people cared about, and suddenly he's now an activist doing this online and in the real world.
That's awesome.
Okay, great. If there are other questions from the audience, there's another mic on the other side, or you can come over here. But we've got another one from Twitter. It's from Sudden Eternity. The hashtag TYTLive. Do you believe the current methodology of today's political polling is properly measuring the opinions of millennials' views?
That's a great question. I don't know the methodology, but I don't think that they hone in specifically on millennials. I mean, what do you guys think?
No, I don't think that they do.
Yeah,
I think that they do what they've always done, is use past years' models to try to do the best job you can. But I mean, arguably, a lot of polling outlets haven't done well even prior to the rise of what are now the millennials. And I think that they don't really know how they should break down the demographics. They don't know how much of their sample should be people who voted in prior elections. Should they perhaps estimate more youth engagement in this election? And those sorts of assumptions are what makes a poll either accurate or inaccurate. And I think that it's increasingly difficult for them to choose correctly in those cases. But we don't have any other alternative, really.
Liz?
Yeah, it's just funny because, okay, who has a landline? Yeah, okay. What? Who answers an unknown number on their phone? Yeah. So it's always like, no, hell no. And so that's how they do polling.
Yeah.
And so you're not getting a lot of millennials essentially,
Yeah.
even when you're trying, because the techniques are so old and haven't been revolutionized and haven't been able to come to our phones. Like it's crazy to me that you actually can't vote with your phone, or that like I can do online banking and transfer large amounts of money, but I can't vote or I can't be polled on these questions. So I think we need to update that.
Yeah. All right, I guess we'll take a few questions from the audience. Let's go ahead and start with you.
Thank you. So my question is, with information becoming so fast-paced in all these different platforms, do you think this leads to sort of shallow consumption where we really don't get the whole story and we don't fully digest the story?
I think that that's definitely an issue that you see. I'll give you an example. I feel like there are a lot of really big stories that don't get enough play. They don't get enough traction, and it upsets me because they're extremely important stories. So recently there was an anonymous whistleblower who spoke to The Intercept, I believe Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept, and it was about President Obama's foreign policy and the intel that they used to put people on these so-called kill lists and to do drone strikes and signature strikes. And the information was explosive. I mean, we have American citizens abroad who are being placed on kill lists with faulty information, faulty intel on them. And so for me, that was a huge story. We spent at least 20 minutes on it on the show, and I thought that it was gonna blow up, similar to how the Edward Snowden story blew up, but it didn't. It didn't, no one's talking about it, and it drives me crazy because when you talk about hostility toward the United States, what do you think causes that hostility? It's us bombing innocent civilians abroad. So I see situations like that that make me realize that, yeah, the 24-hour news cycle does have a negative impact on the way that we consume news and the way that we actually process it.
Yeah, I would say just force yourself to read whole stories. That's part of the reason I still get a print version of the newspaper, is because it's a little easier for me to sit there, read entire stories, read stories that maybe I wouldn't click on during the day. And yes, people absolutely just read headlines and leads. That's why at Huffington Post and other news outlets, we spend so much time coming up with our headlines, because we know that is what most people are going to read and pay attention to. But some of the best stuff in news stories is often buried. Some of the best quotes, all of that. I think blogs were always very good about that, at reading documents or reading news stories even in depth, pulling out, what's in, paragraph 10, this explosive quote, and making it the story and doing something new around that. So you guys definitely should do that, because there's so much good stuff buried that reporters bury in stories.
Yeah, really fast. So I love what you said about you see it and then you want to look deeper into it. And so the last question involved the polling methodology. I get so excited now when I see a new poll comes out, Ben Carson's up or whatever, because then I'm like, okay, let me see the methodology. Let's see how these sons of bitches are lying to me this time. and you have it. Like, you can click on the link and you can literally see, oh, what the hell? They're including people who didn't even watch the debate. What the hell's that about? Whereas if it was on the TV 50 years ago, you wouldn't be able to do that. But yeah, people's attention span is too short. I proposed a segment once called "It's Been 6 Months," where we look back to the stories we talked about 6 months ago, and people in the newsroom are like, nobody cares about that. That's the problem. And I said, oh yeah, they're not gonna. But either it was important and worthwhile or it wasn't. Simply because it was the news of the day. Either you care about the lion or you don't care about the lion.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, what happened? What happened with that guy that shot Cecil the lion? Like, were there any
He's
consequences?
shot other stuff since then.
I know, and it's just we have short attention spans. I think that's
Animals,
also a consequence of the way we do media today. I mean, YouTube, for instance, long-form content doesn't do well on YouTube. I know that better than anyone else. The panel show that I host used to be a long-form show. And it didn't do well because people aren't going to sit down and watch a 45-minute discussion on a serious topic, on foreign policy. They want a quick, 3 to 5 minute video on the news. And so that just kind of speaks to the attention span that you see online. I want to get to more questions, so go ahead.
So I know that on Think Tank, you guys do a lot of videos involving science, which is scientific literacy is just very important to the political sphere, considering debates like climate change and abortion and things like that. But I'm just wondering, what are you guys, as the Young Turks, the main channel, doing to promote that, other than reporting on the occasional Republican gaffe when they pick up a snowball as evidence against climate change?
You want to take
Yeah, I
that?
remember that when he brought it out on the House floor and everything. So, I mean, the problem is, it's a problem that I want to help solve, although in a very real sense, I am largely still myself scientifically illiterate. I failed physics class because inside of my physics book in class, I was literally reading Harry Potter. And it turns out that you don't do well if you do that. Now, I'm curious about science. I believe that I have developed a critical enough way of approaching stories and research that I end up with good information. What I think we attempt to do we talk a lot about psychological studies, we talk a lot about climate change. There's certain types of science that we talk about. And in some videos, like on Think Tank, we're trying to teach you how to take in that information, how to question things, and that sort of thing. But in general, I think that we're just trying to stimulate continued lifelong interest in science and a belief that ongoing scientific research has value, that it applies to people's lives, that it's not purely a White Tower sort of thing. And we hope that if people take an interest in it, that they will then start to, independently of the Young Turks, go and consume that information. If they're still in school, perhaps move into a hard science or something like that. And so I think that's, day by day, that's the biggest way that we try to help out the problem.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Alex. I feel like a product of the Reagan era. My news source, namely, I feel old school. Like I use TYT and Huffington and Al Jazeera America, and I'm one of 10 millennials that does not have a Facebook page. And I feel like I'm a little behind the times. I'm wondering if that's a little narrow-sighted, ignorant of me not to take part in that. Like, as far as Twitter, I'm like this close because I feel like that has legitimacy. But Facebook, I don't know.
Well, there are great things happening in digital media that I know I'm personally experiencing. So Facebook, I used to laugh when anyone would say go to Facebook for news, but now Facebook is making really great headway when it comes to video content. So I'm seeing Al Jazeera videos shared like crazy, AJ Plus videos specifically shared like crazy on Facebook, and they're doing some really great work. Our videos are blowing up on Facebook. There are some stories, like, I don't know if any of you followed the Atlanta public school cheating story. Yeah, so these teachers who were caught doing cheating for standardized testing were charged with racketeering, and they were facing an insane amount of time in prison. We covered that on YouTube. We also put it up on Facebook. The Facebook video got way more views because of the sharing. So it's a good way of getting important news stories out and making sure that they get the attention that they need. With Twitter, I mean, you gotta join Twitter at least. And the great thing about Twitter is you get to choose who you follow. So if there are specific news sites that you love to get your news from, well, all of a sudden you'll see them in your feed. But my advice is also to diversify. So I try to follow media outlets that I hate and don't agree with, because you don't want to create like this bubble where everyone around you agrees with you. You want to hear varying points of view. So that would be my advice. What do you guys think?
Yeah, and I think Facebook's trying to be more like Twitter, and Twitter's trying to be more like Facebook. So we're going to see a lot of changes, and Facebook has been doing a lot of amazing work with journalists. I mean, there's the native articles living now in the app. They're pushing video content in a huge way. And Facebook users are actually much more politically engaged than we think they are. And so there's a lot of interesting coverage going on there. And if you want to like have an app that like blocks all of the wedding proposals, engagement, and babies, there's apparently an app for that. Yeah. So you can cut that stuff out. And then it's just like interesting.
You could just you could literally hide that person from your newsfeed.
Yes.
There's that option as well.
Unfollow.
See you, Mom.
Yeah. All right. We only have time for one more question, so I'll take it from you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, my name's Sky, and my question, I wrote it down. So, how much influence has the new media had in the implosion of the Jeb campaign? And what can we learn from that? Because last year everyone was all like, he's going to be the Republican nominee. He's going to be the Republican nominee, and then boom, 7%, 9%.
I don't think new media's to blame for his implosion.
I
think he is.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, I saw traditional news outlets pick him apart the next day and in the moment when, I mean, he like talked about warm kisses. Like I don't really take like the blame for his mistakes. We covered his mistakes, and I think that's doing responsible journalism.
I think he has Donald Trump also to thank for highlighting some of his weaknesses. And I think if Donald Trump does nothing but take Jeb Bush down, he'll be very happy about it, since it seems like that's in large part why he got into the race. So, I think, Jeb Bush's campaign obviously had weaknesses on its own, but Donald Trump called them out and showed sort of what a weak candidate he was.
Yeah, that's another thing. I'm glad that you mentioned that. Trump is very good with social media because he does the exact opposite of what most politicians do. He goes on Twitter and he's extremely unfiltered, and that goes viral. And so what is the press going to cover? Are they going to cover Jeb's boring ass campaign, or are they going to cover what Donald Trump is saying on his crazy, Twitter feed? So that's what I've noticed. Anyway, guys, I just want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to have this great discussion. I hope we all learned something. I know that I certainly did. John Idarola, Amanda Turkle, John tass-parker, and also Elizabeth Plank of wood. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. You're awesome.
Thank you.